The ash was still warm when Mabel Talbot stepped off the buckboard and saw what remained of the Turner homestead. Not much. Not nearly much at all. A chimney standing alone like a gravestone, black and skeletal against the pale October sky. A scatter of charred timber that had once been walls, once been a roof, once been the kind of solid, promising structure a man builds when he believes the future is something worth building toward. And in the middle of all that devastation, sitting on an overturned water trough with his forearms on his knees and his head bowed so low his hat had slid forward, and was in serious danger of falling into the soot, was Clarence Turner. He did not look up when the buckboard stopped. He did not look up when old Pete Marsh, who had driven her from the Ridge Creek station, cleared his throat twice, and then gave up and clicked the horses back into motion, leaving her standing there alone on the edge of the destruction with her traveling case in one hand and her hat pinned loose in the other because she had been gripping it the entire journey without realizing it. She stood there. The wind moved through the burned-out beams and made a sound she could not name, something between a moan and a whisper. Clarence Turner finally lifted his head. The man she saw was not the man described in the letters. Not the careful, measured prose of a rancher who had spoken about the land with a kind of reverent restraint, who had listed his assets with honest precision, who had written, in one letter that she had read so many times the fold lines were turning white, that he did not want a woman who needed rescuing. He wanted a woman who wanted to stand alongside someone and build something real. That man had squared shoulders in her mind. That man had a future arranged in neat rows like the fence posts he had described driving into the east pasture. This man had red-rimmed eyes and a jaw that had forgotten how to hold itself together. This man had ash in his hair and ash on his hands and ash on the collar of a shirt that had once, she could tell, been washed and pressed, because the habits of careful living do not disappear overnight even when everything else does. He looked at her. She looked at him. She said, "You are Clarence Turner." It was not a question. It was an anchor. She said it because someone needed to say something that was true and solid, and that was the only truth available to either of them in that moment. He said, "Yes," she said, "I am Mabel Talbot. I came from Baton Rouge. I answered your advertisement in the Missouri Democrat, and I have been traveling for 11 days, and I understand that the situation has changed considerably since you placed that advertisement." He stood up then, slowly, the way a man stands when his body has forgotten it is supposed to move. He was tall. She had not expected that, though she could not say why, as if grief had a particular height. He said, "Miss Talbot, I sent a telegram to the Ridge Creek station. I told them to tell you. They told me," she said. "Pete Marsh told me on the drive over. He told me about the fire. He told me about the barn, the livestock, the supply stores. He told me your father's house is gone." Paused. "He told me your father is gone too." Clarence Turner made a sound she felt rather than heard, a sound that was not a word but was the closest thing to a word that a man can make when the thing he has been holding back all night finds a crack in the wall. She set her traveling case down on the cleanest patch of ground she could find, which was still gray with ash. She said, "You have nothing left." He said, "That is correct, Miss Talbot, which is why I sent the telegram. You should not have come." She looked at him steadily. She had brown eyes that people frequently underestimated because they were quiet eyes, patient eyes, the kind of eyes that did not make dramatic announcements but absorbed everything and forgot nothing. She said, "That is a good place to begin." The silence that followed was enormous. Clarence Turner stared at her like she had spoken in a language he was still in the process of learning, and then something shifted in his expression. Something cracked open just slightly, not enough to be called hope, but enough to be called the space where hope might eventually fit. He said, "I beg your pardon," she said. "Nothing left. That means nothing holding you back. Nothing already built wrong that has to be torn down and started over. No habits of the wrong kind already set into the foundation." She looked at the chimney, at the cleared land beyond it, at the October sky that was, whatever else could be said about it, enormous and open and not on fire anymore. Where I come from, the worst thing a person can inherit is someone else's finished life. You have nothing finished here. You have everything to decide. Clarence Turner sat back down on the water trough. Not because his legs failed him, she thought, but because he suddenly needed to think at a height closer to the ground. He said quietly, "My father died in that fire," she said. "I know." He said, "He built this place. 30 years. She said, "I know that too," he said, "and you are standing there telling me that is a good place to begin." "I am," she said. He looked at her for a very long time. The wind moved the ash around their feet. He said, "You are either the bravest woman I have ever encountered, Miss Talbot, or you have suffered something significant enough that nothing much frightens you anymore." She was quiet for exactly one breath. She said, "Perhaps both." Now she needed to understand how they had gotten here, both of them. Not just how she had traveled 11 days from Baton Rouge to the Kansas Territory in the autumn of 1879. Not just how the fire had come and taken everything Clarence Turner had in a single violent night, but how two people in possession of hidden wounds and dark pasts had come to be standing in the ash of a destroyed life on a Tuesday morning, with the particular quality of stillness that precedes something enormous. Mabel Talbot had grown up in Baton Rouge in a house that smelled of river damp and something her mother called propriety, which turned out, over time, to mean silence. Her father had been a cotton factor, prosperous enough, cautious enough, and her mother had been a woman who treated reputation the way other people treated fine china, with obsessive, airless care. Mabel had been educated at a school where girls learned French and painting and the correct way to pour tea, and she had learned all of it competently and been bored to a kind of internal fever by the time she was 17. She had not been a rebel in the dramatic sense. She had not run away or made scenes. She had simply noticed, with the quiet precision that was her particular gift, that the life being arranged around her like furniture in a room she had never chosen was not a life she wanted to live. She watched her older sister Charlotte marry a respectable man who turned out to have a secret she could not speak of in this story without darkening it beyond recovery, and she watched her mother pretend not to know, and she watched the pretending corrode Charlotte from the inside out, and she made a private decision that she would rather be afraid of the unknown than certain of the wrong thing. The advertisement in the Missouri Democrat had been placed by Clarence Turner in June of 1879. Clarence Turner, 31 years of age, rancher, Kansas Territory, Ridge Creek County, was seeking a woman of practical temperament and honest nature to be his wife and partner in building a ranch on land his father had broken ground on 10 years prior. He had listed his assets with the precision of an honest man. The land, the livestock count, the house his father had built, the well, the eastern pasture that had been newly fenced, the western pasture that was still being cleared. He had written that he was not a man given to poetry, but that he had been told his letters were clear, and he hoped clear was sufficient. Mabel had read that letter in her bedroom, while the sound of her mother entertaining the son of a neighboring family drifted up the stairs, a young man whose chief qualification for her hand was that his family owned a great deal of land and who had, on the one occasion he had spoken to her directly, remarked that a woman who read too many newspapers had a tendency toward opinions, and he said this as if opinions were a communicable disease. She wrote back to Clarence Turner that same evening. She wrote that she was 26 years of age, that she had a practical temperament, and she supposed an honest nature, that she had managed her father's household accounts for 4 years after his bookkeeper died, and no one else had thought to learn the system, and that she was not afraid of hard work or open country, though she had not yet experienced the latter in any great quantity. She wrote that clear was more than sufficient, that she in fact preferred it, and that if he was genuinely seeking a partner rather than an ornament, she was genuinely interested in partnering. They had exchanged 7 letters over the course of 3 months, each one more direct than the last, each one peeling back another thin layer of the careful, practiced surface people present to the world. Clarence had written about his father, Henry Turner, who had come to Kansas in 1869 with $40 and a mule and a willingness to work that bordered. His son wrote with dry affection, on the theological. He had written that his father was the best man he knew and the most exasperating, and that they had argued about the eastern pasture fencing for 6 months, and were only recently speaking again with full warmth. He had written about the land itself with a love that was almost involuntary, like it was the one subject where his natural restraint forgot itself. Mabel had written about Charlotte in veiled terms. She had written that she had witnessed what it looked like when a person surrendered their truth to keep the peace, and that she had made a private vow she would not do the same. She had written this carefully, a little afraid of what he would think of a woman who admitted to private vows and suppressed rebellions. He had written back, "A woman who has made promises to herself about how she intends to live seems to me the most trustworthy kind of person there is, because she is accountable to someone she cannot deceive." After that letter, she had made her decision. After that letter, she had told her mother, and the scene that followed had been considerable, and her mother had used the word disgrace several times, and her mother had said that answering an advertisement in a newspaper was the kind of thing that women without options did, and Mabel had said, very quietly, that she was choosing to be a woman without those particular options, and that there was a difference. She had booked her passage on the southbound rail to St. Louis and then west in mid-September. She had arrived at the Ridge Creek station at 7:30 on the morning of October the 14th, 1879, which was, as it happened, approximately 16 hours after the fire. The story of the fire was this. Henry Turner was 71 years old and had been, by all accounts, in possession of more stubbornness than was strictly healthy in a man of that age. He had a lantern he had owned for 20 years and a habit of reading in bed, which his son had asked him to abandon on more than one occasion, and on the night of the 13th of October he had fallen asleep with the lantern still burning, the oil tipped, the bedclothes caught. By the time Clarence, who slept in a separate structure that had been the original one-room claim shack while the main house was being finished, woke to the sound and the light, the main house was already beyond saving. He had gotten his father out. That was the thing that was equally true and equally devastating. He had gotten him out, had pulled him clear of the doorway and into the yard, and Henry Turner had been alive and speaking, had gripped his son's arm and said something that Clarence could not quite hear over the sound of the fire, and then in the same minute he had stopped breathing. The doctor, who came at 4 in the morning, said it was his heart, said the shock had been too much for a man his age, said it was, in the medical sense, a mercy. Clarence Turner had sat in the yard and watched the fire complete its work because there was nothing else to do. That was the morning Mabel Talbot arrived. She had not gone back to Ridge Creek. She had not even seriously considered it. She stood in the ash and looked at Clarence Turner and made a second private decision, that whatever this was going to be, it was going to be something real. The practical questions came first, as practical questions generally do when there is nothing available to distract from them. Where would she stay? There was a widow in town, a Mrs. Adeline Foss, who kept a respectable boarding house on the main street of Ridge Creek, and Clarence arranged for Mabel to take a room there, paying for the first 2 weeks from the small amount of cash money he had on his person the night of the fire, which he had shoved into his trouser pocket out of habit when he ran from the claim shack, which had turned out to be a crucial piece of luck. Where would Clarence stay? The claim shack was still standing. It was 8 feet by 10 feet, had a dirt floor, a wood stove, and a sleeping pallet, and it was, as he told Mabel when he showed it to her with the particular expression of a man determined not to apologize for what he cannot help, sufficient. She looked at the claim shack. She looked at him. She said, "What is your plan?" He had a plan. She was glad to discover that. She had been afraid, sitting in the buckboard all the way from Ridge Creek, that she was going to arrive and find a man who had been broken into something passive, something that had given up. She had been prepared to be patient if that was the case, but she had privately hoped it was not. His plan was this. The land was his, clear and certain, the deed filed at the county seat, and survived the fire in its strongbox, which was buried under the collapsed remains of the main house, and would need to be excavated, but was almost certainly intact. The livestock had survived largely because they were in the outer pasture that week, all except the 2 pigs which had been lost in the barn fire. He had a neighbor, a man named Daniel Whitmore, who ran cattle on the adjacent land, who had already ridden over at dawn that morning to say that Clarence could use his barn in the meantime for the horses and the equipment they could salvage. Clarence had approximately $60 in cash. He had no materials to rebuild. He had no help and no time before winter. Mabel listened to all of this in front of the claim shack while the morning worked its way up toward noon. She said, how much would it cost to buy materials for a single-room structure that could survive the winter? Solid, not luxurious, functional. He looked at her carefully. He said, $40, maybe $45. Lumber is expensive here. If I can get the framing up before the ground freezes, I can close it in. But I cannot afford to pay workers. She said, I have $80. He went very still. She said, I sold my mother's pearls before I left Baton Rouge. They were given to me at my grandmother's death, and they were mine to sell, and I sold them because I knew I was coming here to start a life, not to arrive as a burden. I have $80 in the lining of my traveling case. He said, Miss Talbot, I cannot take your money. She said, it is not a gift, it is an investment. I am proposing to invest $80 in a structure that I will also be living in, assuming the situation develops as we originally intended. She paused. Unless you have changed your mind about the original intention. He looked at her for a long moment. There was something in his face she could not fully read, something compounded of grief and surprise and something else, something that was not quite the way a man looks at a prospective arrangement, and was more the way a man looks at something he had not anticipated and is not yet sure how to hold. He said, I have not changed my mind. She said, good, then let us go to the lumber yard. He almost smiled. It was not a complete smile, it was more the ghost of one, the suggestion that somewhere under the ash and the exhaustion and the weight of a grief that was still less than 24 hours old, there was a man who was capable of smiling. He said, you are not what I expected, Miss Talbot. She said, I will take that as a compliment. He said, it is one. They went to the lumber yard that afternoon. It was run by a man named Gerald Oakes, who was known in Ridge Creek for the combination of an honest price and a bad temper, and who looked at Mabel when Clarence introduced her with the particular look that a certain kind of man in a certain kind of era gave to women who appeared to be making decisions. A look that was not quite hostile, but was not quite respectful either. And Mabel returned his gaze with her own quiet steadiness, until he appeared to conclude that the path of least resistance was simply to help. The lumber was ordered. Delivery was set for 3 days hence. Clarence shook Gerald Oakes's hand with the firm grip of a man transacting business he intends to honor, and they walked back out into the main street of Ridge Creek in the sharp October light. The town was modest. A general store, the lumber yard, a saloon which appeared to be doing a respectable business even in the middle of the afternoon, a doctor's office, the boarding house, a livery, a small church at the eastern end of the street that looked like it needed a new coat of paint but had an air of sturdy intention about it. About 300 people, she would later learn, in and around Ridge Creek. A young town. A town still deciding what it was going to be. She liked it. She had not expected to like it as immediately as she did. There was something in the undecided quality of it that suited her. It had not yet become rigid. It had not yet decided what was proper and what was not, or if it had not done so completely, and there were still cracks in the structure through which a person might fit themselves if they were determined. Clarence walked her back to Mrs. Foss's boarding house. At the door he stopped and turned and looked at her with the straightforward, slightly uncertain quality she had already begun to understand was his particular variety of sincerity. He said, I want to thank you for what you did today. The lumber, the steadiness. I know you arrived here to find everything changed, and I did not handle it with much grace, she said. You handled it with perfect honesty. That is better than grace. He said, I should tell you that I am going to rebuild. It will take time and it will be hard, and this winter will be difficult. I do not want you to make any decisions about the future arrangement based on what you see right now. I do not want you to feel, she said, Clarence. He stopped. She said, I did not come here because I thought it would be easy. I came here because you wrote me 7 letters in which you were completely honest with me about who you are and what you wanted, and that is a rarer thing than you might know from where you have been standing. I'm not fragile, and I'm not making decisions based on fear. I will be here in the morning if you still want to discuss the arrangement. He looked at her for a moment that was several degrees warmer than a professional arrangement warranted. He said, I will be here in the morning. She went inside. She stood in the small, clean room that Mrs. Foss had given her, with its iron bed and its washstand and its single window that looked out over the street, and she allowed herself, for the first time since she had stepped off the buckboard and seen the ash, to feel the full weight of the strangeness of her situation. She was 2,000 miles from everything she had known. She was standing in a rented room in a prairie town that was still deciding what it was. She had given her $80 to a man she had never met before that morning to buy lumber for a house they were not yet certain they would share. She sat on the edge of the bed and pressed her hands flat against her knees and breathed. Then she opened her traveling case and took out the 7th letter, the one about the woman with promises to herself being the most trustworthy kind, and she read it again. Then she went downstairs and asked Mrs. Foss if she might help with supper preparation, because she was not a person who could sit still in uncertainty when there were useful things to be done. Mrs. Adeline Foss was 62 years old, had been widowed twice, and had opinions about both experiences that she shared with a directness that Mabel found immediately bracing and thoroughly enjoyable. She had a large kitchen with a good stove, and she made a pot roast that was, she said without embarrassment, the finest pot roast in Ridge Creek County, and she was not wrong about that. She also had opinions about Clarence Turner. She said, while they were peeling potatoes side by side in the kitchen that smelled of good cooking and wood smoke, he is a good man. I do not say that about many men. I say it carefully, and I say it now. His father was a good man too, though a difficult one in the way that men who have survived very hard things by the force of their own will tend to be difficult. Mabel said, What do you mean, difficult? Mrs. Foss said, Henry Turner did not ask for help. Not ever. It became a kind of pride with him, and then it became a kind of trap, because there were times when he needed help, and instead of asking, he simply pushed through by himself, and the cost of it accumulated. Clarence grew up watching that, and I think he both admired it and was frightened by it, and he does not always know which response is operating when. Mabel said, That explains something. Mrs. Foss said, What does it explain? Mabel said, He looked almost panicked when I offered the money for the lumber, not because he did not need it, because he could not find a framework in which accepting it from me was acceptable. Mrs. Foss looked at her with an expression of reappraisal. She said, You are a perceptive woman, Miss Talbot. Mabel said, I had good teachers. None of them intended to teach me what they actually taught me, but still. The lumber arrived on the 17th. By then Mabel had been in Ridge Creek for 3 days, and in those 3 days the shape of her daily life had begun to take form in the way that life does when a determined woman applies herself to the problem of existence. She had walked the town. She had met the storekeeper, a broad, red-faced man named Carl Beecham, who appeared to be the informal clearinghouse of all local information, and his wife Ruth, who was the actual clearinghouse, but was more discreet about it. She had introduced herself at the church on Sunday with the self-possession of a woman accustomed to presenting herself well in social situations, and had found the minister, Reverend Thomas Alley, to be a thoughtful man who preached a version of faith she did not find suffocating. She had also spent time every morning and evening at the burned homestead, helping Clarence sift through the wreckage. It was grim work. The strongbox was recovered on the 16th, exactly as Clarence had predicted, intact, and he opened it with his hands still filthy with ash to confirm that the deed was unharmed, and the expression on his face when he held that piece of paper was the expression of a man finding something worth holding onto. They worked side by side in an easy silence that surprised them both. He did not treat her like a visitor to be managed or protected from the harder parts of the work. She suspected he had wondered if she would be offended by this, or if she would expect a more delicate treatment, and she suspected her willingness to carry timber and shift rubble had settled something in him. Some question he had been carrying about whether the woman who had written those letters actually matched what the letters contained. On the evening of the 16th, after the strongbox was recovered, and the sun was going down in a long orange strip along the western horizon, they sat on the stone foundation of the destroyed house and drank water from a canteen, and Clarence said, "Tell me about your sister." Mabel went still in the way she went still when something surprised her, which was different from a flinch. It was more an internal stillness, a pause while she recalibrated. She said, "I mentioned her in my letters only obliquely." He said, "I know, I noticed the obliqueness." She looked at the horizon. The orange was turning to purple now at the edges. She said, "Her name is Charlotte. She is 32. She married a man named Preston Whitfield when she was 19 because he was from the right family and had the right money and said the right things. He was also a man who carried a dark past in him like a stone, something that had happened before, something that had made him into a shape that fit badly against any life that required honesty." She paused. "He was not violent with her. I want to be clear about that. He was something I almost think is worse, which is corrosive. He made her feel small in 1,000 ways that were each individually deniable, and she accepted it because she had been taught that acceptance was a virtue." Clarence was very quiet beside her. She said, "I watched her accept herself into nothing, and I decided I would rather go somewhere frightening and unknown than stay somewhere familiar and slowly disappear." He said, "That is why you answered the advertisement." She said, "That is part of why. The other part is that your letters sounded like someone who was genuinely trying to find a partner, not a possession, and that seemed worth 2,000 miles." He was quiet for a moment. The last of the orange light was fading. He said, "My mother died when I was 9, fever. My father raised me alone, and he did it with everything he had, which was considerable, but there were things he did not know how to teach me because he did not know them himself. Things about how to be with another person without it being a transaction or a battle." He turned the canteen in his hands. "I want to do it differently. I want to know how to be with someone in the way that both people stay whole. I do not know precisely how to do that, but I know I want to try." The purple had turned to dark blue. The first stars were appearing. Mabel said, "I think that wanting to try correctly is most of the battle." He looked at her then, and in the last of the light she could see his face fully for the first time, not as a landscape of grief and exhaustion, but as a face, a particular face that was strong and tired and honest, and, she thought, quietly beautiful in the way that things are beautiful when they are exactly what they appear to be and nothing false. He said, "I think I would like to begin properly. I know the circumstances have been extraordinary, and I know I have not managed to present myself to best advantage. But if you are willing, I would like to begin as we intended and see what this becomes." She said, "I am willing." He reached out and shook her hand. It was a formal gesture, the gesture of a man who was trying to do things properly, and she shook it with equal formality. And then they both, at the exact same moment, laughed, not a large laugh, just a small surprised one, and it was the first genuine lightness either of them had felt in days. The building began the next morning. It would be dishonest to pretend that building a house from scratch with 2 people, one of whom was also grieving and managing a ranch's daily operations, was anything other than exhausting, frustrating, occasionally infuriating, and frequently cold. October in Kansas in 1879 was not a gentle month. The wind came off the plains with an opinion about everything, and it expressed that opinion directly and without mercy. Daniel Whitmore came to help on the first 2 days, which was a significant gift, because he knew how to frame walls with an efficiency born of experience, and he was not a man who chattered unnecessarily while doing it. He was a weathered man of about 45, sparse with words but generous with labor, and he brought his farmhand, a young man named Isaac who was about 20, and worked with the cheerful, tireless energy of someone who had not yet discovered that the body has limits. Mabel did not stand back and observe the building from a respectful distance. She carried lumber. She learned quickly how to hold boards steady for nailing, how to pass tools efficiently, how to be useful rather than decorative in a working situation. Clarence watched her with a sideways attention he probably thought she did not notice, and she noticed it, and she found it pleasing. Daniel Whitmore, on the second day, working beside her while they fitted boards into the floor structure, said quietly, "He has not been this focused since before his father got sick last spring." She said, "His father was ill before the fire," Whitmore said. "Heart was going. Doc Greer told him in April. Henry knew he did not have long. He spent the spring driving himself harder than ever because that was how he was built, like admitting to a limitation would make it more true." He paused, nailing a board with 3 precise strokes. Clarence knew too. It was why he put that advertisement in the paper. He wanted his father to see him settled before he stopped. Mabel said, "Before Henry died." Whitmore said, "Yes." She let that sit inside her for a moment. She thought about Clarence reading her first letter and feeling the particular urgency of a man who wanted his father to witness something before time ran out. And she thought about the way grief does not have a single cause but layers itself. And she thought about the 7 letters and the precision in them, the carefulness. A man who was trying to do things right because doing things right had become more important than ever. She said, "He did not tell me that in the letters." Whitmore said, "No, I do not imagine he did. He is not a man who deploys his pain as an argument." She liked that. She liked that enormously. The structure went up in 2 weeks, which was faster than expected because the weather held longer than anyone anticipated, and because Mabel turned out to be both practically skilled and a precise keeper of the work schedule, which she managed with a quiet authority that earned her the respect of Isaac, who was not naturally given to respecting the authority of women, but found that her instructions were always correct and her reasoning was always transparent, which made them impossible to ignore. The house was a single room to begin with, 14 feet by 16, with a solid wood stove, a plank floor, 2 windows with shutters that could be barred against the winter wind, and a door that hung true. It was not grand. It was sufficient in the best sense of the word, everything necessary and nothing wasted. The question of their actual arrangement resolved itself in the 2nd week of November. They had been conducting their courtship, if it could be called that, through the hours of shared labor, through the daily evening conversations that had become a fixed point in both their lives, through the careful, deliberate process of 2 people learning the full 3-dimensional reality of each other after knowing only the flat representation of letters. There had been a conversation about the hidden motive question. She had raised it directly because she needed to know, and she was not a person who circled around necessary things. She had said on an evening when they were sitting in the half-built house by a fire Clarence had made in the new stove to test the draw, with the walls up and the roof on but no furniture yet except a crate and 2 upturned logs serving as seats, "I need to ask you something and I need you to answer honestly." He had said, "All right." She had said, "When you wrote that advertisement, what exactly were you seeking? I mean in full, not the version edited for propriety." He had considered this for a moment. He said, "Someone to build with, someone to talk to, someone who would not disappear into the role of a wife the way my father's model of life suggested women were supposed to. He loved my mother, I believe he truly did, but he loved her in the way you love something fragile with a kind of protective distance, and when she was gone there was very little of a shared interior life left because they had not really been building one together. They had been parallel. He looked at the fire in the stove. I did not want parallel. I wanted something more integrated than that. She said, and now that everything has changed, he looked at her. He said, now I want the same thing, but I understand it more clearly. Losing my father in the specific way I lost him, with the fire and the suddenness of it, has taken away whatever patience I had for not being clear about what matters to me. What matters to me is this, is what is happening here, she said. Then let us get married. He said, I thought I was supposed to ask. She said, we are past supposed to. He had smiled then, fully, and it was the first time she had seen him smile with his whole face, and it was a remarkable thing to see. It changed the geography of him. It made him look younger and less guarded and like someone she wanted to be in the same room with for a very long time. He said, yes, let us get married. They were married by Reverend Alley on the 29th of November, 1879, in the small church at the east end of Ridge Creek's Main Street that did indeed need a new coat of paint. The congregation was modest. Mrs. Foss and her current boarders, Daniel Whitmore and his wife Clara, young Isaac, Carl Beecham and his wife Ruth, and a scattering of the townspeople who had come to know Mabel in her weeks at the boarding house. Mabel wore the blue dress she had brought from Baton Rouge, which was the best dress she owned, and which she had originally thought might be too formal for a frontier wedding, and then decided that there was no such thing as too formal for the day you married someone you intended to love for the rest of your life. She had her hair pinned up the way she wore it when she wanted to feel like herself and not like a performance. Clarence wore a dark coat that had survived the fire because it had been in the claim shack, and a shirt that Mrs. Foss had pressed for him that morning without being asked, and he had shaved with unusual care, and his hair was neat, and he looked, Mabel thought as she walked toward him down the aisle of the small church, like a man walking into something he had decided on completely. The vows were traditional. When it came time to say I will, Clarence said it in a clear, quiet voice that was the most certain she had ever heard from him, which was saying something because he was already a fairly certain kind of man. When it came time for her to say I will, she said it in the same voice, the same quiet certainty, and she felt it all the way through her body, felt it settle into the base of her spine the way truth settles when it finds its proper place. There was a gathering afterward at Mrs. Foss's house, because Mrs. Foss had decided this was happening with or without being asked, and she had made her pot roast, and Clara Whitmore had brought 2 pies, and someone had brought a bottle of bourbon that made 2 circuits around the gathering before being politely but firmly redirected to the men's side of the room. Mabel talked with Clara Whitmore for a long time and liked her immediately. Clara was a woman who had built a life out here over 12 years, and wore that fact with a particular kind of quiet pride that had nothing to do with performance and everything to do with having actually done the thing. She had 2 children, a son of 9 and a daughter of 7, and she spoke of the country with the authority of someone who had earned the right to her own opinion of it. She said to Mabel, late in the evening when the gathering was thinning and Clarence was in conversation with Daniel about the spring fencing plans, "It is hard here. I will not pretend it is not. The winters are long and the distances are real, and there are days when you are lonely in a way that the people around you cannot quite fix because they are dealing with the same loneliness." Mabel said, "How do you manage it?" Clara said, "You find what is interesting. There is always something interesting if you are willing to look at it without the lens of what you expected." She paused. "And you find someone who faces the same direction you do, someone whose eyes are pointing toward the same horizon." She glanced at Clarence across the room. "He is a man who is facing forward now. He was not always. Before you came, before the fire even, he was a man who was spending a lot of energy bracing himself against loss. Now he is looking ahead." Mabel said, "The fire changed something." Clara said, "You changed something. The fire just cleared the ground." They moved into the finished house that night, the 2 of them, with the wood stove burning and a lamp Mabel had bought at Beecham's general store casting a warm orange circle on the plank floor, and the wind outside doing its Kansas opinions against the shutters. It was cold, and it was small, and it was theirs, and that made it something she had never had before, a space that was genuinely, unconditionally hers. Clarence had put together a proper bedstead from salvaged timber and new rope, and there was a real mattress from the general store's supply, and he had made 2 shelves on the wall for her things because he had noticed, without being asked, that she had a small collection of books in her traveling case and had nowhere to put them. She stood in the center of the room and looked at those shelves and felt something in her chest that was not quite gratitude and not quite happiness, but was something larger than either, something that had to do with being genuinely seen by another person and having it feel entirely safe. She said, "You built me shelves." He said, "You have books. You need somewhere to put them," she said. "Clarence Turner." He said, "Yes," she said, "I believe I am going to love you very much." He crossed the room in 2 steps and stood in front of her, and he was close enough that she could see the particular green-gray of his eyes in the lamplight, and he said, "I believe I have already begun." The winter of 1879 to 1880 in Kansas was one of the hardest on record. Snow came in December with a seriousness of purpose that was almost personal, and the temperatures dropped in January to depths that turned the landscape into something silent and absolutely still. A white enormity stretching in every direction that was beautiful in the specific way that things are beautiful when they are also dangerous. They were largely confined to the house, the 2 of them, which might have been claustrophobic if they had been different people, or if the closeness had revealed something difficult. What it revealed instead was a deepening. They read together, trading books back and forth across the small table with commentary that was sometimes fierce and always interesting. They played chess on a board Mabel had also brought from Baton Rouge, the one remnant of her father's study that she had packed without entirely knowing why, and she discovered that Clarence played with the same quality of patient strategic attention he brought to everything, which meant that the games lasted a long time and were genuinely contested, and she won about half of them. They talked about everything. The dark past question, which had only been partially excavated in those first weeks, was excavated more thoroughly during the winter months, because there was nowhere to go and nothing to do but be honest about things. Clarence told her about the year he had been 19 and had ridden south with a man named Garrett Mays on a cattle drive that had gone wrong in ways he did not want to discuss fully but would discuss in outline. There had been a forced choice, a moment when he had to decide between loyalty to a man he had trusted and doing the right thing. And he had done the right thing, and it had cost him the friendship and cost Garrett Mays his freedom, because the wrong thing Garrett was doing was the kind of wrong thing that ended in a jail cell once Clarence had made his report to the marshal. He had been carrying a version of that story as a kind of defining weight ever since, a question about whether he was the kind of man who could be trusted in the absolute sense or only in the conditional sense. She listened to this completely. She said, "You did the right thing." He said, "Yes, but the right thing cost someone I cared about." She said, "That is exactly what the right thing does sometimes. If it never cost anything, it would not be courage, it would just be convenience." He looked at her for a long moment. He said, "Where do you keep all of this, Mabel? All of this clear-eyed wisdom? You just have it ready." She said, "I grew up in a house full of people choosing the wrong things to avoid paying a cost. You develop opinions." He said, "I am glad you did." She told him in fuller detail about Charlotte. She told him about the year she had spent watching her sister attempt to leave Preston Whitfield and be persuaded back, because Preston had a way of constructing traps out of the language of love, turning every attempt at freedom into a proof of her failure as a wife, a proof of her inadequacy as a person. She told him that Charlotte was still there, still in that house in Baton Rouge, and that she wrote to her every month and received careful, coded letters back that told her between the lines that Charlotte was enduring but not yet ready to act. Clarence said, "What will you do about that?" She said, "Keep writing, keep the door open. Be somewhere she knows she can come to if she ever gathers the courage." She paused, and pray that she gathers it." He reached across the table and put his hand over hers. Not a dramatic gesture, just a steady one, the kind of gesture that is not performing comfort but simply providing it. She turned her hand over and held his back. Outside, the snow continued its silent work. Inside, the lamp burned and the stove radiated, and the two of them sat at their small table in the house they had built out of necessity, and $80 worth of lumber and a matching willingness to begin at the beginning. And they were, quietly and genuinely, happy. Spring came in late March with an urgency that felt almost apologetic after the long winter, everything erupting into color and movement at once, the grass greening overnight, the birds returning in loud opinionated groups, the sky doing something with light that made it look newly invented. The work of the ranch resumed with full force. Clarence had plans for the spring that were ambitious in the right way, ambitious in the way of a man who has reassessed what he is building and why, rather than simply continuing the momentum of the previous version. He wanted to expand the cattle operation, purchase additional livestock in May when the cattle drives came through and prices were accessible, and he wanted to start construction on a proper barn with a loft, which would require additional labor. He also wanted to hire help. This was a significant step for Clarence Turner, the son of a man who had never asked for help, and Mabel noticed the difficulty of it and said nothing except to express confidence in the decision, because she understood that sometimes the most useful thing a person can do is stand beside someone while they do the hard thing rather than tell them why the hard thing is worth doing. He hired 2 men in April. One was Isaac, Daniel Whitmore's former farmhand, who had decided he wanted to work full-time for the Turner operation and had a quiet, solid competence that made him an easy choice. The other was a man named Marcus Webb, who had come to Ridge Creek from Missouri in the winter and had been living at Beecham's boarding stable while looking for work, and who was in his mid-30s and had the particular worn-around-the-edges quality of a man who had made several significant mistakes and was currently in the middle of deciding whether to make more or less of them going forward. Marcus Webb had a secret. Mabel noticed it within 3 days of his arrival. She noticed it in the way he responded to direct questions with answers that were accurate but not complete, in the way he watched the road coming from the south with a regularity that was not casual interest, in the small, involuntary alertness he showed at the sound of a horse coming up the lane. She did not say anything to Clarence immediately. She watched. The thing about Marcus Webb's secret was that it was not, as it turned out, a malicious one. It was a trapped one. He had a wife in Missouri. A wife he had left, not out of abandonment, but out of a specific desperate plan that had turned out to be less functional than he had hoped. He had owed money to a man named Theodore Ashe who had, over the course of 2 years, moved from being a creditor to being something more like a captor, using the debt as leverage to compel Marcus to do work he was not proud of, work in the category of transporting things and moving people for money that did not bear close examination. He had fled Missouri with his wife's blessing, both of them agreeing that he would get clear and settled, and then she would follow. The problem was that Theodore Ashe had followed him. This revealed itself on a Tuesday in May when Clarence came back to the house in the middle of the afternoon, with the expression of a man carrying something he would rather not be carrying, and told Mabel that a rider had come to the property that morning while Marcus was working the east pasture, a rider who had asked for Marcus Webb by name and who had not left a card but had left a message, which was the kind of message made up entirely of implication. Mabel said, "What kind of implication?" Clarence said, "The kind that suggests Marcus owes a debt and the debt is being called." She said, "Did you speak to Marcus?" He said, "Yes." She said, "What did he tell you?" Clarence sat down at the table and ran a hand through his hair and told her what Marcus had told him, which was most of the above. He looked conflicted in the specific way of a man who genuinely wants to do right by the people in his employ and is not certain what that looks like in this situation. She said, "What did you tell him?" He said, "I told him he could stay." She looked at him. She said, "Good." He said, "It may bring trouble to the property, Mabel." She said, "Then we will deal with the trouble. A man running from a trap set by someone with leverage over him is not a man we abandon. That is how you compound injustice." Clarence looked at her with an expression she had learned to interpret as the look he had when she articulated something he had already felt but had not yet formed into words. He said, "You have a very clear moral compass." She said, "I have a very clear experience of what it looks like when it goes missing." Theodore Ashe arrived himself 3 weeks later, which was a Tuesday in late May when the weather was warm, and the sky was full of enormous white clouds moving in a stately procession toward the east. He came with 2 men who wore the kind of weapons that men wear when they intend them to be noticed, and he was a compact, well-dressed man with the particular cold courtesy of someone who is comfortable using other people. He arrived at the Turner property and found Clarence Turner in the yard, repairing a section of fence, and Marcus Webb in the barn doing nothing except waiting, because he had seen the riders coming from a quarter-mile off. Mabel was in the house. She positioned herself at the window. Ashe stated his case with the brisk efficiency of a man who had made similar statements many times. Marcus Webb owed him $460. The debt had accrued over 2 years. He was here to collect. Clarence said steadily that he understood the nature of the claim. Ashe said that Marcus Webb had, in addition to owing the money, absconded from Missouri while performing a job for Ashe and had failed to complete it, which constituted a separate obligation. Clarence said quietly that he would need to know the nature of that job before he could have any meaningful conversation about the obligation. Ashe's composure developed a small fault line. Clarence said, "Because if the job in question was the kind of job that does not survive description in the open air, then the nature of the obligation may look somewhat different to a county marshal than it does to you." The 2 armed men shifted slightly. Ashe said, with a smile that did not involve his eyes, that he did not think threats were necessary in a business negotiation. Clarence said that he had not made a threat but had made an observation, and that he was happy to continue the conversation in whatever direction was most useful, but that Marcus Webb was his employee and was on his property, and would remain on his property, unless Marcus Webb himself chose otherwise. It was then that Mabel came out of the house. She came out with the particular composure of someone who has decided to be present and has no particular anxiety about being present, and she walked to Clarence's side and stood there, and she looked at Theodore Ashe with the quiet brown eyes that forgot nothing. She said, "Mr. Ashe." He looked at her with the particular assessment of a man recalculating a situation. She said, "I understand you are here about a debt. May I ask whether you have the debt documented?" "In writing with dates and terms signed by both parties." Ashe said carefully that he had documentation. She said, "Then I would suggest that the appropriate course is to present that documentation to the county court in Ridge Creek, which is the legal mechanism designed precisely for this kind of dispute. My husband and I will not impede a legal process. We will, however, not facilitate an extra-legal one." Ashe looked at Clarence. Clarence said, "My wife has stated our position clearly." Ashe and his men left. They rode south. There was a feeling when they had gone like a held breath releasing. Marcus came out of the barn. He looked at both of them with an expression compounded of relief and mortification. He said, "I am sorry to have brought this to your door." Clarence said, "The debt." "Is it the $460?" he said. Marcus said, "Yes." Clarence said, "And the job, was it the kind of thing he will be willing to put into a court document?" Marcus said slowly, "No." Clarence said, "Then we can be fairly confident he will not pursue it through legal channels." Marcus said, "He may pursue it through other channels." Clarence said, "Then we will deal with that when and if it comes." It did not come. Theodore Ashe and his men did not return to Ridge Creek. Carl Beecham reported, about a month later, that he had heard from a freighter coming through from Missouri that a man fitting Ashe's description had been arrested in Lawrence on an unrelated charge, something involving fraudulent land titles, and was expected to be engaged with the legal system for some considerable time. Mabel received this news with a satisfaction she did not bother to conceal. Marcus Webb's wife, Eleanor, arrived in Ridge Creek in July. She was a small, practical woman with red hair and a collection of opinions she had apparently been saving up for the journey and now distributed freely among anyone who would listen. And she immediately became one of Mabel's favorite people in Ridge Creek, which was saying something. Eleanor and Marcus set up in a small place at the edge of the Whitmore property, renting 2 rooms from Daniel, and Marcus continued to work for Clarence. And the following spring he and Eleanor would build their own place on a parcel they purchased. And the whole progression of their rescue and survival would give Mabel a deep, particular satisfaction for years to come. The satisfaction of a person who has seen how injustice compounds and has participated, in a small way, in interrupting it. But that was ahead, for now the summer of 1880. The barn was completed in June, a proper structure, 16 feet by 30 with a good loft and a sound roof, and the day it was finished Clarence stood in front of it with his arms crossed and looked at it for a long time in silence, and Mabel came and stood beside him, and she knew what he was thinking about without being told. She said he would have liked it. Clarence said quietly. He would have criticized the angle of the east wall, she said, and then helped you fix it. He said, yes. And then told everyone in town he had designed the whole thing himself. She laughed and he laughed, and it was the particular kind of laughter that contains grief within it but is not crushed by it, the kind that means the grief has been carried long enough to stop being only weight and start being also memory. He said, I think about him every day. She said, I know. He said, I think about how he never got to meet you. She said, I think I met him in your letters. He turned to look at her. She said, everything you told me about him, the stubbornness and the love of the land and the way he argued about the fence posts but came around eventually, that is not a description. That is a portrait. I know him through you. He put his arm around her shoulders and she leaned into him slightly, just the small, easy lean of 2 people who have learned the specific geography of standing together, and they looked at the barn in the summer afternoon light. She said, also he would have liked me. Clarence said, with absolute certainty, he would have loved you. The cattle operation grew that summer and into the fall with the momentum of a venture that had been properly planned by 2 people who were paying attention. They purchased 17 head of cattle at the May Drive, adding to the existing stock, and the eastern pasture expansion was completed by August. Clarence was becoming known in Ridge Creek County as a careful, reliable operator, the kind of man who paid his debts on time and kept his fences and did not sell inferior stock. Mabel had also found her own footing in the community in ways that went beyond being Clarence Turner's wife. She had organized, with the voluntary cooperation of Ruth Beecham and Clara Whitmore and Eleanor Webb, a small lending library using the collection of books from her traveling case as the initial stock, supplemented by donations from various townspeople who had books they were willing to share, and housed in a corner of Beecham's general store. It was an informal, practical thing, a box of books with a handwritten log of who had borrowed what, and it served perhaps 40 people in its first year, which was a small number unless you were one of those 40 people, and the book in question had given you something you needed. Clarence said, watching her organize the initial collection on the shelf Carl Beecham had grudgingly but willingly installed, you are going to civilize this town. She said, I am going to make it more interesting. That is not necessarily the same thing, he said. In your case, I think it is. In September of 1880, Mabel wrote to Charlotte again. She had been writing monthly, steady and faithful, the way you maintain a rope connection to someone you hope to eventually pull to safety. The letters she received back had been, over the previous months, changing in a direction that was slow but unmistakable, like a season shifting. Charlotte was beginning, in her careful coded language, to describe her situation with more clarity, less performed contentment, more honest accounting of the cost. In September, Mabel wrote clearly, without ambiguity, without the careful indirection that had characterized her previous approaches. She wrote, You have a place here. If you leave, and I pray you do, you have a place here, and it is not charity and it is not pity. It is your sister who loves you, and a husband who will treat you with the dignity you deserve, and a community that does not yet have enough of you in it. The railroad goes through Ridge Creek now. The journey is 14 days, and I have done it, and it is survivable. Charlotte arrived in November of 1880, which was the greatest surprise and the deepest joy of Mabel's year. She arrived thin and quiet, and with the particular carefulness of a person who has been managing another person's reactions for so long that all their movements have become preemptive. She arrived with one traveling case and a look in her eyes that was partly terrified and partly something else, something that Mabel recognized as the earliest stage of a person beginning to reclaim themselves. Mabel met her at the Ridge Creek station and held her for a long time and felt her sister shaking slightly and held her tighter. Clarence met Charlotte with the same uncomplicated warmth he brought to everything that mattered to Mabel, which was to say that he shook her hand and helped with her case and made a pot of coffee and said, without preamble, "You are welcome here for as long as you need, which may be a long time, and that is not a problem." Charlotte looked at him. She looked at Mabel. She said, "You wrote about him as being honest. You did not write that it was this obvious." Mabel said, "I did not want to oversell it." Clarence said, "She absolutely oversold it. Do not believe everything you read." Charlotte laughed for the first time in what appeared to have been quite a while, and the sound of it filled the small house, and Mabel felt it in her chest like something warm. Charlotte stayed. She stayed through the winter in the house, sleeping on the trundle bed they had built into the back corner, and she slowly, in the way of a person learning to walk again after an injury, began to expand back into the full size of herself. She was intelligent, Clarence observed, in a way that had been systematically discouraged for years. She had opinions she had been keeping secret. She had, it turned out, a gift for numbers that Mabel had not known about, and she began in January to help Clarence with the ranch accounts with a precision that bordered on the spectacular. Mabel watched this with the particular satisfaction of someone who has successfully done the thing they set out to do, which was to keep the door open long enough for the person on the other side to find it. Mabel also discovered, in January of 1881, that she was expecting a child. She told Clarence on a Sunday morning before church in the kitchen, while the coffee was brewing and the light through the east window was doing something particularly fine with the snow outside. He turned from the stove and looked at her. She watched the news move through his face, first surprise, then something much larger than surprise, something she could not precisely name because it was an entirely new expression, one she had not seen before and would come to love deeply, pure, unguarded gladness. He said, "Mabel." She said, "Yes." He crossed the kitchen in what appeared to be one step, and she rose from the chair, and he held her with the careful, fierce quality of someone holding something profoundly precious, and she could feel him breathing, could feel the particular unsteadiness of a man who has been given something he did not fully let himself expect. He said into her hair, "My father would have," he stopped. She said, "I know." He held her tighter. Charlotte was told over breakfast, and reacted with a flood of genuine happiness that was, Mabel thought, also partly a reaction to finding herself in the presence of uncomplicated good news for the first time in longer than she could easily say. The baby was born in September of 1881. A boy. A healthy, furiously opinionated boy who arrived at 2:30 in the morning with a set of lungs that immediately established his intention to be heard. They named him Henry James Turner. Clarence held his son for the first time in the bedroom of their house, which was not the same 14-by-16 room of the first winter, but a larger house they had built in the spring. 3 rooms, with a proper bedroom and a kitchen and a sitting room, built with their own money from the ranch operation which had produced its first genuine profit the previous autumn. He held Henry James Turner and looked at him with the expression Mabel would think about for the rest of her life, the expression of a man who is seeing in the face of a new person everything that has been lost and everything that continues. He said very quietly to the baby, "You come from good people. I want you to know that." Mabel, exhausted and happy and watching from the pillow, said, "He cannot understand you yet." Clarence said, "He will." Charlotte had, in the months since her arrival, been building something of her own. She had filed for divorce from Preston Whitfield in the fall of 1880, through the offices of a lawyer in Lawrence whom Daniel Whitmore had recommended, and who turned out to be both competent and gratifyingly unsentimental about the situation. The process was not fast, and it was not without its difficult moments, because Preston Whitfield was a man who did not respond well to the removal of something he considered his property, and there had been letters of the persuasive and then of the threatening variety, and Mabel had read each one with Clarence, and they had, together, helped Charlotte compose responses that were legally precise and emotionally uninstructing, and the lawyer in Lawrence had done the rest. The divorce was finalized in March of 1881. Charlotte Whitfield became Charlotte Talbot again, which was, she said, like putting on a coat she had forgotten she owned. She was rebuilding. The ranch accounts were under her management, and she was good at it, formally acknowledged by Clarence as a paid position, which was not a common arrangement but was a correct one. She had begun to smile in a way that reached her eyes. She had begun to have opinions about things not related to survival, which Mabel recognized as a significant stage in the process of reclaiming a life. In the spring of 1882, Charlotte met a man named William Crane at the Ridge Creek Spring Social, which was a yearly event organized by Reverend Alley's church as an opportunity for the community to socialize in a context that was not a funeral or a drought or a cattle dispute. William Crane was a school teacher who had come to Ridge Creek the previous autumn to take over from the previous teacher, who had left to marry a man in Topeka. He was 34, patient, quietly funny, and had the particular quality of a man who genuinely liked women as intelligent equals, which was not a universal quality but was, when found, distinctive. He danced with Charlotte twice at the spring social. He sought out her company at subsequent gatherings. He asked Mabel, at one point, with a directness she found immediately respectable, whether she thought Charlotte might welcome his attention or whether he was misreading a situation. Mabel said, "I think Charlotte has had enough of men who do not ask permission. You are asking permission. That is already a significant distinction." He said, "I am not asking permission. I am asking if I am being foolish." She said, "You are not being foolish." Charlotte and William Crane were married in October of 1882 in the same church where Mabel and Clarence had been married 3 years before. It was a larger wedding, because by that time both of them were known in the community, and the gathering afterward was correspondingly more festive. Clarence danced with Mabel in the street outside the church until it was fully dark, the two of them moving in the lamplight that spilled from the boarding house windows, and she rested her head briefly against his shoulder and felt the specific, profound contentment of a life that has become, despite everything or perhaps because of everything, exactly what she hoped it might be. Young Henry Turner attended this event in his mother's arms, dressed in a small coat that Mrs. Foss had made for him, and proceeded to express his opinions about the music with enthusiasm. The years moved on with the particular quality of good years, which is not that nothing difficult happens, because difficulty is not a failure of good years, but that the difficult things are met by people who have the resources to meet them, the internal resources of two people who have been honest with each other long enough to have built something solid. In 1883, there was a bad summer, too dry, the kind of dry that tests a cattle operation fundamentally. Clarence and Daniel Whitmore and Marcus Webb collaborated on a water management solution involving a series of tanks fed by a secondary creek that ran through the Whitmore property, and the arrangement required a degree of trust and cooperation between the three operations that tested all of them, and resulted in all three operations surviving a year that finished off 2 other ranches in the county. The experience of that summer gave all 3 men something it is hard to name, except to say it was the thing that results from having done something genuinely hard together. A quiet, unassailable mutual confidence. Mabel organized, during that same dry summer, a coordinated effort to ensure that the families most affected in the area beyond the 3 operations were not left without basic supplies, going through the church and through Beecham's general store, and through her own relationships in the community to create a quiet, practical network of support that did not require anyone to perform gratitude or endure humiliation. Ruth Beecham, who had the specific gift of logistics, was her primary partner in this effort, and the 2 of them worked with the brisk, focused efficiency of people who understand that there is a problem, there is a solution, and the gap between the 2 is primarily a matter of will and organization. Reverend Alley, at the following Sunday service, said something general about the spirit of community and mutual aid that Mabel found a little too sweeping in its religious framing, but acknowledged was well-intentioned. Carl Beecham said, more practically and more usefully, that Mabel Turner was the most effective person in Ridge Creek County, and that he had said so from the beginning and was prepared to defend this position. Mabel said that Carl Beecham was extremely kind and should direct his compliments toward Ruth, who had done most of the actual work. Ruth Beecham said she was not accepting compliments in August when it was this hot, and everyone could wait until September. In September of 1883, Mabel discovered she was expecting again. The second child was born in May of 1884, a girl, born in the easier way that second children sometimes manage, as if they have received instructions from the first one about what to expect. They named her Clara Rose Turner, Clara for Clara Whitmore, who had been among the first friends in this place, and Rose because it was Clarence's mother's middle name, which he had not mentioned until the question of names arose and Mabel had said immediately that she was honored. Henry, who was 2 years old and fully in possession of all the opinions he had announced at birth and had been developing additional ones steadily, regarded his new sister with the deep, uncertain gravity of a person encountering something unprecedented and not yet certain whether to be pleased about it. He eventually concluded that he was pleased. He made this conclusion at approximately the 4-month mark when Clara Rose Turner looked directly at him for the first time with her wide, considering eyes, and something in the exchange apparently settled the matter. Clarence watched this development with an expression that was not the enormous gladness of the first birth, but something quieter and deeper, the expression of a man who has been given enough to understand what enough means and is not taking it lightly. One evening in the fall of 1884, when the children were asleep and the house was quiet and the lamp was burning low and they were sitting at the kitchen table with the remnants of coffee between them, Mabel said, "I want to tell you something." He said, "All right," she said. "When I stepped off that buckboard and saw the ash and saw you sitting on that water trough, I made a calculation, not a cold one, an honest one. I thought, this man has lost everything, and either that has broken him into something that cannot be rebuilt or it has cleared the ground, and I decided to find out which." He said, "And what did you find?" she said. "I found someone who, when everything was taken from him, still had who he was, which turned out to be the only thing that matters." He was very quiet. She said, "I said something to you that morning that I meant but that I have been thinking about ever since. I said nothing left was a good place to begin, and I have been turning it over and I think I was right, but not for the reason I thought. I did not mean that loss is good. I meant that you were visible in a way people rarely are. When everything that a person has accumulated to present themselves to the world has been stripped away, what remains is the actual person, and what remained was someone I wanted to know." Clarence said, very slowly, "I have been thinking about that morning too, about how you stood there with the ash around your feet and your hat pin in your hand, and you looked at me and said I was a good place to begin. And I thought, This woman is either going to save my life or she is going to make it very interesting. Possibly both. She said both. He said both. He reached across the table and took her hand, and she held it, and the fire in the stove made its low, steady sound. And outside the Kansas darkness was enormous and full of stars. Charlotte and William Crane, in the years that followed, built a life of their own in Ridge Creek that was everything Charlotte's previous life had not been. William expanded the school with the help of the community, and Charlotte ran the accounts for both the school and several additional businesses in town, earning a reputation for precision and trustworthiness that made her, in practical terms, one of the more essential figures in the local economy. They had a daughter in 1884 named Josephine, who immediately became Henry Turner's primary social and intellectual rival, a relationship that was contentious and stimulating for both of them in the way that the best relationships between strong-willed children tend to be. Marcus and Eleanor Webb had two sons, one in 1882 and one in 1884, and Marcus had by 1884 taken on sufficient independent responsibility within the Turner operation to be a genuine partner, rather than simply an employee, a transition that Clarence managed with the same natural equity he brought to the rest of his life. Isaac, who had worked for Clarence since the beginning, had at 27 married a young woman named Pearl who had come to Ridge Creek with her family from Iowa, and they were building their own place on a parcel of land east of the Turner property. The community that had been when Mabel arrived, a town still deciding what it was, had decided. It had decided to be a real place, with real people, with the full texture of human experience. Its injustices, which were real and which Mabel continued to notice and name when she could. Its generosities, which were equally real. Its losses and its continuances. The library in Beecham's general store outgrew its corner and moved in 1885 into a dedicated room at the back of the church building, which Reverend Alley provided with the particular enthusiasm of a man who had been looking for ways to make his building more used. By 1886, it had over 200 volumes and a formal lending system managed by Pearl, who had shown an aptitude for it, and a monthly reading circle that met on Thursday evenings and was, depending on who you asked, either a literary society or the most productive gossip operation in the county. Mabel attended the reading circle every Thursday. She was the one who selected the books most of the time, or at least the ones that generated the most interesting arguments, which she considered a specific skill. In the spring of 1886, Henry Turner, who was 4 years old, asked his father why the field behind the barn was not planted. Clarence, who was repairing harness at the time, said, "It is grazing land." Henry said, "But it could be planted." Clarence looked at his son for a moment. He said, "You sound like your grandfather." Henry said, "Who is my grandfather?" Clarence put down the harness. He said, "Come here and I will tell you about him." He told Henry about Henry James Turner the elder, the man who had come to Kansas with $40 and a mule and the willingness to work that bordered on the theological. He told him about the stubbornness and the love of the land and the argument about the east pasture fence posts. He told him about the fire and the morning after and a woman who had arrived and said that nothing left was a good place to begin. He was telling a story and he did not know Mabel was in the doorway, having come from the house with a jug of water and had stopped to listen. He said to Henry, "And she was right. She was right and I have been right ever since, which is the best thing I can tell you about how things work." Henry, who was 4 and had the attention span appropriate to that age, said, "Can we plant the field?" Clarence said, "Maybe a small part of it." Henry said, "A big part." Clarence said, "We will negotiate." He looked up and saw Mabel in the doorway, and his expression was the full-face smile, the one that changed the geography of him, the one she had first seen by the light of a lantern in a half-built house on a cold November night. She came in and set down the water jug, and Henry, immediately redirected his negotiation campaign to include her as a second party, and the afternoon dissolved into the easy, rolling warmth of a family in its natural state, in a barn in Kansas in the spring, with the light coming through the gaps in the boards and the horses shifting in their stalls, and the smell of hay and wood smoke, and something else that was impossible to name, but was the smell of a life that is exactly what it is supposed to be. Mabel Turner, née Talbot, had come from Baton Rouge to the Kansas territory with a traveling case and $80 worth of pearls, and the private conviction that the unknown was preferable to the wrong certainty. She had arrived in the ash of a destroyed morning and looked at a man who had nothing, and said that was a good place to begin, and she had been right in a way she had not yet fully understood when she said it. What she had meant, standing there in the ash at 7:30 on a Tuesday morning in October of 1879, was something practical and forward-looking, nothing to hold you back, nothing built wrong, everything to decide. What she had come to understand, in the years of building and growing and losing and finding, and talking across kitchen tables by lamplight and standing in sunlit doorways and watching children discover the world, was that she had also been right in a deeper sense. A man with nothing left to protect had nothing left to hide, and a man with nothing left to hide was, finally, fully available to love. The story of Clarence and Mabel Turner was the story of two people who arrived at each other by way of destruction and decided to build something true. It was not a simple story, and it did not pretend to be. It contained betrayal at a distance in the stories they each carried of lives that had tried to go wrong. It contained dark pasts and forced choices and hidden motives encountered and rejected. It contained secrets surfaced in firelight and grief carried forward into joy. But at its center, at the absolute steady center of it, it was a love story. It was the story of a man on a water trough in the ash of everything he had, and a woman with a hat pin and a traveling case and brown eyes that forgot nothing, who looked at each other across the ruin of one future and decided together to begin. They grew old in that house in Ridge Creek, Kansas. They added rooms twice more. Once when Henry was 8 and Clara Rose was 4 and there was clearly not enough space. And once when they were in their 40s and had resources enough to build the kind of house that had rooms for guests and a proper parlor that contained the library that had grown far beyond what one corner of a general store could hold. Clarence's hair went gray in his mid-40s in a way that Mabel told him made him look distinguished, and that he insisted made him look old, and they had this argument happily for the remainder of their lives. Henry Turner grew up to be a man of the land in the way his grandfather had been, and his father had refined, passionate about the work, stubborn about the important things, funny about the rest. He stayed in Ridge Creek County and took over much of the operation in his late 20s, and Clarence watched this with the particular satisfaction of a man who has succeeded at the thing that actually mattered to him. Clara Rose Turner became, to no one who knew the family's great surprise, a person of extraordinary intellectual engagement who read everything Mabel's library could supply, and then started ordering books through the mail from Kansas City and sent Louis, and who eventually left Ridge Creek to study, which was an adventure of its own kind, and who came back in the end, because she said the prairie had gotten into her in a way she could not evacuate. Charlotte and William Crane lived a long and genuinely happy life in Ridge Creek. Charlotte's transformation from the thin, careful woman who arrived at the station in November of 1880 to the confident, capable, warmly laughing woman she became was one of the great continuous pleasures of Mabel's life to witness. And on the evenings when the two families were gathered together, the Turners and the Cranes and eventually the children's children, the house full of voices and the lamps burning and the prairie dark and star-filled outside, Mabel would look at Charlotte and they would exchange the look that only sisters exchange, the look that says, "We made it here, we made it to this." On a morning in October of 1889, Exactly 10 years after Mabel had stepped off the buckboard into the ash of the Turner homestead, she walked out to the east pasture before breakfast while the sun was just coming up and stood at the fence and looked at the land. It was fully in its autumn color, the grass golden, the sky that specific October blue that she had come to think of as the most beautiful color in the world. The cattle were in the far corner, dark shapes against the gold. The barn was solid and real in the middle distance. The house, her house, with its additions and its solid roof and its curtained windows, was behind her. Clarence came up behind her. She had heard him coming, had heard the particular rhythm of his footsteps on the dry grass, the footsteps she knew better than her own. He stood beside her and looked at the same view. He said, 10 years. She said, 10 years. He said, you came in off the buckboard and I looked up and I thought, this woman does not belong here. She is from somewhere with parlors and music schools. She is going to look at the ash and turn straight around. She said, and instead. He said, instead you set down your traveling case on the cleanest patch of ground you could find, and told me that nothing left was a good place to begin. The sun was fully up now, laying its long light across the golden field. She said, was I right? He put his arm around her shoulders. She leaned into him, the easy, practiced lean of 10 years. The cattle moved in the far corner, unhurried. A hawk crossed the sky from north to south on a long, slow arc. He said, you were right about everything. She said, I am going to require that in writing. He laughed. The sound went out into the October morning and became part of it, became part of the land, became part of the permanent record of the life they had built out of nothing. On a morning after a fire, in the long golden country of Kansas, where everything was still being decided, and everything was possible, and the sky was enormous and full of what was coming next.